It started with a single photograph, a grainy image from 1928, captured outside a theater in Hollywood. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. A crowd had gathered. Men in hats and women in elegant dresses shuffled past the camera. But there, in the corner, walked a woman unlike the others. One hand held to her ear, mouth moving in conversation, as if she were on a phone call. This was decades before cell phones, before satellites, before anyone could imagine walking down the street, speaking into a device smaller than a deck of cards. That frame ignited a firestorm. Who was she? How could she have possibly been using a device that wouldn't exist until the 1980s? The footage was confirmed authentic, untouched, original stock from 1928. And this wasn't the only case. Again and again, throughout history, traces of impossible visitors have appeared. People out of place, knowledge out of time, moments that don't align with the known march of history. These are not tales from comic books or Hollywood scripts. They are fragments from real investigations, military reports, historical anomalies, and first-hand testimonies from ordinary people who claim to have seen the extraordinary. Some of these stories were quietly buried. Others became whispered legends, passed from one generation to the next. All carry a strange echo, as if something or someone slipped through the veil of time. And it's not always a person. Sometimes it's an idea, a machine, a prediction made decades early with uncanny precision, a sketch in a notebook that foretells a technology centuries before it should have been possible, a warning issued before disaster strikes. Across the next 13 chapters, we'll walk through these stories. Some are well known, like the man who posted on internet forums claiming to be from the year 2036. Others are almost forgotten. A man who appeared in Times Square wearing clothes from the 1870s, or the engineer who described black holes forming at CERN 7 years before it happened. Each case invites the same question. What if time doesn't work the way we think it does? What if the past is still happening somewhere? What if the future has already begun? This isn't about proving time travel is real. It's about exploring the edges of what we believe to be true, where science, memory, and myth begin to blur, where certainty falters and possibility takes its place. Because in the end, the question isn't just, is time travel real? The question is deeper, older, more unsettling. If it is real, would we even recognize it when it happened? Welcome to a journey through the folds of time, a reflection on what we know, what we've forgotten, and what might still be waiting for us in the shadows of history. What if the future introduced itself through a username? In the early 2000s, on obscure internet forums buried beneath layers of tech jargon and conspiracy chatter, a user named John Titor appeared. His tone was calm, methodical, not the wild-eyed ramblings of a fantasist, but the measured voice of a man with a mission. He claimed to be a soldier from the year 2036, sent back in time to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer, a forgotten machine with hidden capabilities. People laughed at first. Then they listened. Titor described the architecture of the IBM 5100 in detail, including functions unknown to the public, hidden by engineers, and never disclosed. When former IBM staff confirmed these secrets, the laughter stopped. His posts were filled with precise diagrams of a time displacement device installed in a 1967 Corvette, later upgraded to a Suburban for better cargo capacity. He discussed black hole theory, temporal divergence, and the many worlds interpretation with a fluency that startled physicists. But it wasn't just science. Titer made predictions. He said America would become a nation divided, that a civil conflict would emerge in the aftermath of a major terrorist attack. He posted these warnings in early 2001, months before September 11th changed the world. He said Americans would choose security over liberty, that surveillance would become a way of life, that powerful computers would one day fit in our pockets, connecting people through invisible networks. This was years before smartphones, before social media, before the world learned to live inside screens. And then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he disappeared. His final message was brief. "I'll be leaving this world line shortly. This will be my final post." It's easy to dismiss John Titor as a hoax, a digital ghost born from message boards and speculation. But the precision of his statements, the confirmed secrets he revealed, and the slow unfolding of the world he described still haunt those forums like footprints that refused to fade. Was he real? A time traveler? Or just an unusually well-informed observer of human nature and technological momentum? Or, as some have suggested, was he from a parallel timeline, one not identical to ours, but close enough to echo? John Titor never asked for fame. He never tried to profit. He didn't sell books, go on talk shows, or chase notoriety. He simply appeared, offered a window into another world, and vanished. What if the internet didn't just connect people across space, but across time? And what if the most extraordinary story of our future came and went, while most of us were too distracted to notice? In the end, perhaps the most chilling thing about John Titor wasn't his presence. It was how much of what he said has already come true. It was a warm evening in June 1950, the kind that gives New York City its restless glow. Lights shimmered across Times Square. Crowds moved in waves. Then, in an instant, a man appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and stepped into the path of a taxi. He died on impact. The accident wasn't what puzzled authorities. It was everything else. The man wore a black frock coat and high-buttoned shoes, immaculately preserved but unmistakably from another century. In his pockets, brass buttons, antique currency, a copper beer token from a tavern demolished in 1876. No modern ID. No explanation. His name, according to his papers, was Rudolf Fentz. Captain Hubert V. Riem, a seasoned investigator with the Missing Persons Bureau, took the case. Something about it wouldn't let him go. He searched records, expecting nothing, and instead found everything. In an 1876 missing persons report, there was a man named Rudolf Fentz, age 29, vanished while out for an evening walk. The description matched perfectly, down to the cleft in his chin and the scar on his left hand. The photo, provided by his son, Rudolf Fentz Jr., was a perfect match for the man in the morgue. How could someone disappear in 1876 and reappear unchanged in 1950? The case was quietly closed. Too strange, too dangerous. The city moved on. But Rime never did, nor did the officers who witnessed the evidence firsthand. To them, Rudolf Fentz was more than a riddle. He was a disruption, something that fractured the assumed linearity of time. There are no known tunnels, no machines, no magical storms in this story. Just a man out of time. No reason, no warning, no return. Some say it was a hoax, that stories like these are cobbled together from legends and half-truths. But the original police documents existed. The witnesses were real. The evidence was preserved until, inexplicably, it wasn't. Files disappeared. Names were redacted, photographs misplaced. But memories don't vanish so easily. What if time isn't a river, but a sea? And sometimes, the current drags something across the centuries. What if you could walk out your front door one evening and take a step into another time without even realizing it? And what if the past isn't gone at all, just waiting to catch someone unaware? Rudolph Fentz never asked to become a mystery. He was simply walking home, then somehow walking into the future. Perhaps the strangest time travelers are not the ones who build machines, but the ones who don't even know they've left their own time behind. It began as a leisurely stroll through the manicured gardens of Versailles. On August 10th, 1901, two English academics, Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, set out to explore the historic grounds of the French palace. The day was warm, the sky indifferent. But as they wandered deeper into the estate, the world around them began to change. The air thickened, the light dimmed, sounds grew distant, as if muffled by velvet. And then they saw them, men in green coats with tricorn hats, women in powdered wigs and flowing dresses, servants carrying baskets across the lawns. It was as if they had stepped into another century. Near the Petit Trianon, a woman in 18th century clothing sat sketching on the grass. She looked up briefly, her features delicate, her expression unreadable. Later, the women would come to believe they had seen Marie Antoinette herself, quietly capturing her final summer before the Revolution. The experience lasted only minutes, or maybe hours. Time itself seemed distorted. When they finally returned to their hotel, shaken and breathless, they questioned their sanity. But instead of dismissing it, they investigated. For 10 years, Moberly and Jourdain pored through historical records, maps, and letters. What they found defied logic. The people they had seen, the clothes, the hairstyles, the tools in the gardener's hands, all matched the late 1780s with uncanny precision. They described buildings and paths that no longer existed in 1901, but were confirmed by archived architectural plans from a century earlier. They wrote their findings in a book titled An Adventure, published under pseudonyms in 1911. It sparked fascination, debate, and disbelief. But through it all, their story remained consistent, unwavering in detail and tone. What made their account so compelling wasn't just what they saw, it was how they saw it, not as a dream or vision, but as a real place, solid, tangible, lived in, as if time had folded briefly, allowing two unsuspecting women to wander through a door that should not have been open. Skeptics suggested hallucination, mass delusion, but even the French authorities quietly acknowledged the accuracy of their descriptions. Details they couldn't have known, people they couldn't have imagined, and places that had been erased from public memory. If true, it wasn't just a ghost story. It was something more disorienting, a time slip, a phenomenon where the past overlays the present, not through magic or machines, but through something we don't yet understand. Could certain locations act as temporal echo chambers, replaying moments from history like grooves on a vinyl record? Could memory, trauma, or even architecture serve as anchors for fragments of time to persist? The gardens of Versailles are silent now, tourists brushing past ancient statues. But for two women, on one strange afternoon, the palace did not belong to the 20th century. It belonged to the shadows of revolution. And perhaps, in certain forgotten corners of the world, time still forgets which era it's meant to obey. In the summer of 1955, a man named Morris Jessup opened a letter that would unravel everything he thought he knew about physics, time, and the limits of human experimentation. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher, had written extensively about unexplained aerial phenomena. But the letter he received that day was different. It came from a man calling himself Carlos Allende, or Carl Allen, depending on the day, and its contents read like science fiction. Except Allen wasn't telling a story. He was giving a witness statement. He claimed that in 1943, while serving aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, he had seen the impossible, a United States Navy destroyer, the USS Eldridge, disappear. Not disappear from radar, disappear from sight. Allen described an experiment conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, an attempt by the Navy to render a ship invisible using electromagnetic fields. But something had gone wrong. The Eldridge didn't just vanish. It reappeared hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, only to vanish again and return to Philadelphia minutes later. The experiment, he claimed, had broken more than visibility. It had broken time. The crew paid the price. Some were found fused to the metal of the ship, their bodies embedded in bulkheads. Others went mad. A few became unstuck, phasing in and out of reality, sometimes disappearing for days, then reappearing with stories of alternate times, future cities, or entire lives lived in minutes. One sailor aged 30 years in an afternoon. Another reportedly walked through a wall and never emerged. Allen's letter was filled with terminology far beyond the grasp of most sailors. He described unified field theory, spatial curvature, and magnetic flux in ways eerily consistent with later scientific developments. His knowledge of theoretical physics suggested either a savant or someone with access to highly classified information. Jessup was shaken. He forwarded the letter to the Navy. Weeks later, strange things began to happen. Jessup's car was run off the road. He received threats. Then, without warning, a copy of his book arrived at the Office of Naval Research, annotated in 3 distinct handwritings, filled with cryptic comments and corrections referencing time travel, teleportation, and extraterrestrial involvement in human science. Jessup grew increasingly paranoid. In 1959, he was found dead in his car. Suicide, they said. But those who knew him believed otherwise. To this day, the Philadelphia experiment remains a riddle, wrapped in denial. The Navy insists no such experiment ever occurred. Ship logs, they say, show no irregularities, but the logs are incomplete. Witnesses have disappeared, and whispers continue in bars near the old shipyard, where older men with trembling hands tell stories they were never meant to remember. What if, in 1943, we didn't just bend light, but cracked open the nature of time itself? What if the real danger wasn't invisibility, but the possibility of slipping into somewhere else? Some believe the experiment succeeded far beyond what was intended. Others believe it was a catastrophic failure. Either way, if the USS Eldridge truly did vanish, even for a moment, it may have taken a part of our reality with it, and left behind a crack in the timeline no one can close. It's 1928. Hollywood is a rising star. Outside Grauman's Chinese Theater, cameras capture the premiere of Charlie Chaplin's The Circus. The footage, for decades, sat quietly in archives, a relic of a golden age, until someone looked closer. In 2010, film historian George Clark was reviewing the old reel frame by frame when he noticed something impossible. In the background, a woman walks past the theater entrance. She's dressed in dark clothes, her head tilted, one hand held tightly to her ear. Her lips are moving. She's talking, and she's holding something small, black, rectangular, something that looks eerily like a modern cell phone. She strolls casually, speaking into the device, unaware of the crowd. No one reacts to her. No one seems to notice. And yet, there she is, having a private conversation in a world where portable telecommunication wouldn't exist for another 50 years. Skeptics offered explanations. Maybe it was a hearing aid. Maybe she was talking to herself. But frame-by-frame analysis revealed otherwise. Her posture, her hand placement, her facial movements, all aligned with the habits of modern phone users. She wasn't pretending. She was communicating. Kodak and other film experts verified the footage's authenticity. There were no signs of tampering, no digital overlays, no post-production tricks. The clip was original, unedited, and real. But the woman herself was not on any guest lists. She wasn't an actress. She left no trace in the studio archives. No one knew her name. She appeared in that brief moment and was never seen again. What's more, when researchers reviewed the crowd, other anomalies surfaced, subtle ones. People whose clothes seemed just a little too advanced, stitching techniques that didn't match the 1920s, postures and mannerisms more in line with modern sensibilities than with the era's social customs. They moved differently. They looked out of sync. Was this a mistake, a fluke, or something more deliberate? If someone were to time travel, blending in would be difficult. Language evolves. Fashion changes. Habits betray us. Maybe this woman, and possibly others, weren't trying to go unnoticed. Maybe they were there to observe, to witness, and simply underestimated how carefully the past would be examined in the future. One woman, one device, one fleeting moment captured on film. No name, no explanation, just a ghost in the footage, walking among us decades ahead of her time. And a question that lingers, unresolved. If time travelers do walk among us, would we even know until the camera catches them? Or until history, with all its clarity and all its blur, plays the moment back again, and we finally see what was always there, hiding in plain sight? It was supposed to be an ordinary kitchen repair. In August 2006, Håkan Nordqvist, a Swedish man from the town of Växjö, was fixing a leaky pipe beneath his sink. He reached deep into the cabinet and felt nothing, just open air. Curious, he pushed further, and suddenly the wall gave way. There was a tunnel. Crawling through, he emerged. Not into the crawl space of his home, but into light, into warmth, into the same room, and yet not. The decor was different, sleek, minimal, glowing with technology that responded to touch and voice. The air felt clean. The silence had a hum to it. Sitting on a couch, watching a shimmering, three-dimensional display, was an old man. The man turned and smiled. "I've been expecting you," he said. It was Håkan, or rather, it would be, an older version of himself, decades ahead. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same scar on his hand, the same awkward smile. They spoke. Briefly, but deeply. The older Håkan explained that this wasn't the first time, that the anomaly behind the kitchen had appeared before, that their lives were connected in ways few would ever understand. And then he did something remarkable. He gave his younger self a tattoo, a mark containing Håkan's name and birth date in a font that didn't exist in 2006, using an inking device that left no swelling, no healing, no trace of trauma. The ink shimmered faintly, its pigments oddly alive. Then they took a photograph together. An instant print, the two of them side by side. One man in his 30s, the other nearing 90. smiling, present. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the passage closed. Håkan returned to his leaking pipe, stunned, shaken, forever changed. He never sought fame. He didn't publish a book or seek interviews. It wasn't until investigators heard of the photograph and the tattoo that the story began to circulate. The photo was analyzed. Facial recognition confirmed the two men were the same, aged appropriately, but with subtle aging patterns that software in 2006 couldn't have faked. The tattoo, when tested, showed properties inconsistent with any ink available at the time. Rare elements, unusual molecular structures. When authorities examined his kitchen, they found only solid wall, no tunnel, no passage, just plaster, pipework, and concrete. But the mark remained. So did the photograph. Was it a hoax? An elaborate trick played with unknown technology? Or had Håkan stumbled upon something extraordinary, a rip in space-time, hidden in the most ordinary place of all, a suburban kitchen? His story resists classification, too detailed to dismiss, too simple to sensationalize. Perhaps that's what makes it linger. What if time travel isn't built in laboratories or launched in machines? What if it's waiting behind walls, beneath our floors, tucked between the cracks of the everyday, accessible only by accident and only to those not looking for it? One pipe, one moment, one meeting across time, and a reminder: the future might be closer than we think, watching, waiting, or perhaps waving back. It lay buried for centuries beneath the Aegean Sea, cloaked in rust and coral. When sponge divers off the coast of Antikythera discovered the shipwreck in 1901, they expected little more than statues and coins. Instead, they pulled from the water something far stranger, a corroded hunk of bronze, fragile and silent. It looked like a jumble of gears locked together in death, a curiosity at best. But that machine would go on to challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Now called the Antikythera Mechanism, it has been called the first analog computer, a device from the 1st century BCE capable of tracking the sun, moon, and 5 known planets with stunning accuracy. It could predict eclipses, calculate lunar phases, and even mark the dates of the Olympic Games. All of this using a system of bronze gears more complex than anything known until the 14th century. For decades, scholars didn't believe what they were seeing. The precision of the gearwork, the ratios, the tolerances, the astronomical knowledge was too advanced. Differential gearing, eclipse prediction, sidereal tracking, all hidden inside a box no bigger than a shoebox. It shouldn't have existed. Historians searched the records. No texts from antiquity described anything close to this level of engineering. No other devices like it have ever been found. It's as if someone had taken modern knowledge and folded it back into the past, then disappeared without a trace. Advanced imaging later revealed inscriptions and diagrams too precise for the crude tools of the era. CT scans exposed dozens more hidden gears, revealing that the device originally tracked all known planetary cycles, including those requiring knowledge of elliptical orbits, knowledge supposedly undiscovered until Kepler and Newton, more than 1,500 years later. And the most baffling part, the device wasn't the result of collective evolution in design. It bore the unmistakable signature of a single mind, a singular, masterful intelligence that understood both celestial mechanics and precision engineering far beyond its time. So who built it? Was it the lost genius of the ancient world? A mind whose brilliance simply never found a student? Or, as some quietly wonder, was it knowledge from somewhere else, some other time, passed down, misplaced, or perhaps misremembered? The Antikythera Mechanism didn't just survive the sea, it survived history's attempt to forget it. And now it sits, fragmentary but defiant, in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. A machine out of place, out of time. Its gears no longer move, but its mystery does. What if history isn't just a record of what we've built, but also of what we've lost? Or worse, of what was given to us once and never truly understood? In the silence of its ancient cogs lies a question that still turns quietly. Who taught the past what only the future should know? He painted with anatomy and designed with astronomy. He drew machines that would not exist for hundreds of years and dissected the human body with a precision modern doctors would envy. Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, but parts of his mind, or perhaps his memory, feel as if they came from somewhere else entirely. In his notebooks, buried beneath layers of mirrored handwriting and sketches of birds in flight, Leonardo documented ideas far ahead of his time. Helicopters, submarines, tanks, gear-driven automata, hydraulic machines. He diagrammed the inner workings of the heart with accuracy no one else would achieve until centuries later. He mapped the brain, described blood flow, and captured muscle structure with uncanny foresight. But it wasn't just the ideas, it was the detail. His helicopter design wasn't a dream, it was an engineering diagram. It accounted for torque, lift, and material stress. His tank drawings showed sloped armor, rotating turrets, and systems of gearing that wouldn't appear again until the 20th century. His water pumps anticipated modern irrigation and plumbing systems. His flying machines included concepts of wing loading, center of gravity, and dynamic control surfaces, long before the Wright brothers ever took to the sky. Even his astronomical notes raised eyebrows. He sketched the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the shadows of Saturn's rings, all of it without access to a telescope strong enough to confirm what he seemed to already know. And then there's the handwriting, or rather, the change in it. In the most advanced sections of his journals, the script subtly shifts. Still his hand, but different, as if copying rather than composing, as if transcribing something already known, not discovering it himself. Some researchers have noted that many of these drawings appear fully formed. There are no trial versions, no messy experiments, just the final idea, as if remembered, not invented. Could Leonardo have been touched by something beyond the Renaissance? There are theories, of course. Some say he was a time traveler. Others suggest he accessed a kind of universal memory, a collective consciousness of the future. Some propose he was simply the greatest observer who ever lived. But even the best observation needs raw data. And where exactly would a 15th century artist acquire knowledge of internal combustion engines, steam turbines, and planetary rotation? Perhaps the question isn't whether Leonardo da Vinci was ahead of his time. Perhaps the question is, whose time was he remembering? What if genius, in its purest form, is not invention, but retrieval, a reaching back, or forward? And if that's true, then maybe Da Vinci didn't imagine the future. Maybe he'd already been there. The street looks ordinary. Bold Street, Liverpool, a bustling stretch of shops, cafes, and bookstores. To a casual observer, it's just another high street in an old English city. But beneath the surface of cobblestones and storefronts, something stranger seems to stir. Since the 1960s, people have reported stepping onto Bold Street and suddenly finding themselves in another time. Not metaphorically, literally. Take Frank and Carol Sayers. In 1996, they were shopping when Frank entered a bookstore while Carol waited outside. Minutes later, Frank emerged into the 1960s. The modern shops were gone, replaced by vintage storefronts. Cars from another era rolled by. People passed him wearing clothes decades out of date. Frank was not alone. Others nearby looked equally disoriented, exchanging silent, startled glances. Then, in an instant, everything snapped back. Frank stood blinking in the present, shaken but unharmed. What made his account especially eerie was the precision. The names of the shops, their exact positions, even the merchandise in the windows, all confirmed by archival records to have existed at that location in the 1960s. Another woman, Sarah Martinez, entered a boutique in 2008 and found herself in a department store that hadn't existed since the 1970s. The uniforms, the decor, the prices, all authentic. When she tried to buy a dress, the cashier refused her modern currency. She stepped outside, confused, and the store was gone. In its place, a modern cell phone shop. These aren't isolated events. Hundreds of such incidents have been quietly documented. People crossing invisible thresholds into the past. Sometimes for seconds, sometimes for minutes. Always uninvited. Always unexplained. Security footage from 2006 shows pedestrians changing direction mid-stride, dodging unseen obstacles. Some appear to speak to people who aren't there. Some vanish from one frame and reappear in another with no logical path between. Geologists studying Bold Street found underground tunnels and unusual magnetic anomalies in the bedrock. Weather patterns seem to play a role. The incidents cluster on humid, overcast days with high atmospheric charge. It's as if the conditions briefly open a crack and time bleeds through. What's most mysterious is the consistency. Different people, different years, same past, same buildings, same music, same conversations overheard. It's not that they're revisiting history in general, they're stepping into a very specific version of Liverpool. A snapshot, a memory caught in a loop. Why? No one knows. Some suggest Bold Street is sitting atop a natural temporal fault, a ripple in the timeline where the layers of time rub thin. Others whisper that trauma, emotion, or human memory itself may be etched into certain places, and that under the right conditions, those moments can reassert themselves, not as ghosts, as time itself. So the next time you walk through a familiar street and the air feels different, heavier, quieter, and the world around you seems just slightly off, don't panic, but do pay attention, because you might not be where or when you think you are. Between 1901 and 1944, a quiet man from Kentucky lay down on a couch, closed his eyes, and spoke truths the world was not yet ready to hear. His name was Edgar Cayce, known to some as the Sleeping Prophet. Unlike flamboyant psychics or stage performers, Cayce entered a self-induced trance, his voice calm and slow, delivering information he should have had no access to, diagnoses of medical conditions in people he'd never met, remedies involving herbs and techniques unknown in Western medicine, descriptions of ancient civilizations, lost lands, and coming futures. And most curiously of all, predictions. In 1935, Cayce described a world where people would carry small devices that allowed them to communicate instantly across the globe. He warned that these tools would bring knowledge and isolation, addiction, disconnection. He was describing smartphones and social media long before either existed. He spoke of a vast network of information, a kind of universal library that anyone could access. Today we call it the internet, but his visions went further. He predicted the discovery of DNA as the blueprint of life. He described gene therapy and cellular manipulation decades before the first double helix was photographed. He warned of environmental changes, shifting climates, and rising seas. He identified oil fields years before they were tapped. They are hushis, and he spoke of health treatments, now linked to stem cells and vibrational medicine, that science would one day explore. Skeptics dismissed him. They called it guesswork, coincidence, or cleverly repackaged ideas. But his readings, over 14,000 in number, were meticulously transcribed. Many included technical language far beyond his known education. Some contained scientific concepts that hadn't yet been proposed, let alone proven. And when Case entered trance, his brain waves didn't match sleep, hypnosis, or known psychological states. Doctors who monitored him were baffled. He wasn't dreaming. He was somewhere else. Case claimed he could tune in to the Akashic Records, a supposed cosmic database of every thought, event, and moment across all time. He said he didn't predict the future. He simply saw it. He spoke of future wars, shifts in consciousness, and energy drawn not from matter, but from human intention. He believed the mind could influence physical space. That time was not linear, but layered, accessible. To many, Case was a healer. To others, a prophet. But in retrospect, he may have been something rarer, a human interface with time itself. His trance states remain a medical mystery. His predictions, many of which have since come true, continue to confound. And through it all, Case never sought power or wealth. He worked as a photographer, a Sunday school teacher. He offered readings freely, often at great personal cost. So what do we make of him? A man who, asleep, described future technologies with eerie accuracy? A window into the unconscious mind, or into time? If the future echoes backward, whispering to those willing to listen, then Edgar Case was not just a man dreaming of what might be. He was remembering. And in his memories, we catch a glimpse of something larger, a pattern threading through past, present, and possibility, a reminder that perhaps time is not a wall, but a mirror. And sometimes, someone sees through it. Sometimes, the line between myth and memory blurs in bronze and salt. In the early 20th century, a team of sponge divers searching the turquoise waters off the coast of Greece stumbled upon something lost and impossible. Off the island of Antikythera, they found a Roman shipwreck heavy with statues, coins, and a strange, rusted hunk of machinery. At first, it seemed unremarkable, a tangle of corroded metal barely holding together. But hidden inside that decay was a riddle, a device that, when cleaned and scanned, revealed more than 30 interlocking gears, teeth so precise they could track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Eclipses, solar cycles, lunar phases, even the Olympic calendar. This was not simple craftsmanship. This was computation. Built in the 1st century BCE, the Antikythera Mechanism shattered assumptions about ancient technology. It was, in essence, the world's first computer, a mechanical brain from a world that should not have been able to imagine it, let alone build it. The gearing alone displayed a grasp of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that rivaled 18th century clockmakers. Differential gears, lunar anomaly correction, celestial prediction. But here's the thing. Nothing like it exists in the historical record. No texts describe it. No duplicates have ever been found. It appeared fully formed, and then vanished. The mechanism's creator remains anonymous. The materials suggest it was built in Greece. The knowledge it required suggests something else. Some scholars believe it was the work of a lone genius, a figure whose understanding exceeded his time by millennia. But that only deepens the mystery, because knowledge like this doesn't appear in a vacuum. It builds, piece by piece, generation by generation, unless it came from somewhere else. The device anticipates Kepler's work on planetary motion. It uses numerical ratios lost to history. Its calendar encodes cycles only rediscovered in the Renaissance, and the astronomical models it follows imply a heliocentric worldview, centuries before Copernicus dared suggest it. So what happened? Who built it? And why was it buried in a ship at sea? Some imagine it was a one-of-a-kind artifact smuggled from a lost library. Others wonder if it was built using knowledge passed down through secret lines or handed back through time by someone trying to preserve what was once lost. But maybe the truth is simpler and stranger. Maybe someone saw the stars not just as they were, but as they would be. Maybe someone remembered a future yet to come and built a machine not to change the past, but to remind it. The Antikythera Mechanism is more than a marvel. It's a question cast in bronze. How did such deep knowledge exist? And why did it vanish so completely? And if knowledge like that was possible once, could it return? Or has it already, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize it again? A city under stress, a war-torn world, and a singular moment of confusion, these are the ingredients of a mystery that still echoes through the cracked pavement of our understanding. It happened on a Thursday night, June 1950. Times Square pulsed with life, neon buzzing like bees in a hive. And then, suddenly, a man appeared. He stepped into the street and was struck by a taxi, dying instantly. But death wasn't the mystery. It was his clothes. He wore a black frock coat, tall buttoned shoes, and a silk hat, all brand new, but unmistakably 19th century. In his pockets, $70 in old bills, a letter postmarked 1876, a copper beer token from a bar long demolished, and business cards for a man named Rudolph Fentz. Yet there were no modern items, no driver's license, no address, nothing to tie him to 1950. Authorities ran his name, and in the missing persons archives from 1876, they found an exact match. Rudolph Fentz had disappeared during an evening walk in New York. Aged 29. The description matched. The photograph his son provided? Identical. It was as if a man had stepped out of one century and into another. Mid-stride. Was it a hoax? A coincidence? The official reports were quietly sealed. Whispers filled the hallways of the precinct. And slowly, the incident faded into urban legend. Too strange for the headlines, too persistent to forget. The idea of time slips, not through machines, but through thin places, has existed in cultures around the world for centuries. Folk tales speak of travelers who vanish for a day and return years later, of people who find themselves in lands where time runs differently. What if Rudolph Fentz simply walked across a boundary he didn't know existed, somewhere between here and there, now and then? And if he did, how many others have done the same, disappeared without a trace, not because they were lost, but because they were misplaced? The strange thing about Fentz is how mundane his journey seemed. No mission, no message, just a man who vanished from one sidewalk and reappeared on another. No grand plan, no control, just the wrong moment, the wrong step, or perhaps the exact right one. What if time is not a line, but a hallway, with hidden doors we sometimes walk through without knowing? What if Rudolph Fentz wasn't the beginning of the story, but a reminder of how easily the story can change? And what if, somewhere out there, someone from our time is already walking through another city in another year, confused, unprepared, unaware, and someone, decades from now, will find their photograph and ask, how did they get here? Time is supposed to be simple, a line, a river, a story that flows from beginning to end. But the more we've studied it, the more it resists that story. Across 14 episodes, we've walked through shadowed gardens, sunlit theaters, and silent shipyards. We've listened to men who predicted technology they couldn't possibly know. We've seen photographs that shouldn't exist, machines too advanced, encounters too strange, memories too precise. Each story, on its own, can be doubted. Anomalies, coincidences, hoaxes, but together they form a pattern. A man on the internet predicts future wars and surveillance with eerie precision. A sailor describes a Navy experiment that bends time itself. A Renaissance genius sketches machines and star systems that shouldn't yet be knowable. A woman walks through 1928 with something in her hand, something that doesn't belong. A street in Liverpool echoes the past like a skipping record. Again and again, the past touches the future. The future bleeds into the past. And time bends. So what are we left with? Not proof, but possibility. Maybe time travel isn't a single event, a flash of light or a spinning machine. Maybe it's more subtle, a memory whispered backward, a decision that folds space, a mind open enough, slipping between layers. Maybe those who time travel don't even realize they have. Maybe it's not about going somewhere, but about seeing more of what already is. And maybe time is not a wall, but a lens, distorted, scratched, and smudged by human understanding. The stories we've explored aren't about science fiction. They're about the human urge to understand the impossible. They're about wonder, curiosity, the fragile boundaries of what we consider real. And they're about us. We are time travelers, not in machines, but in memory, in imagination, in the way we preserve the past, fear the future, and try desperately to anchor ourselves in the now. We measure time in hours and minutes, but we feel it in moments, in the way a song collapses a decade, in the smell of dust and rain and old pages, in the way a single photograph can summon the ghost of a loved one or the echo of a year. Maybe time doesn't move at all. Maybe we're the ones in motion. And maybe, just maybe, every once in a while, through accident or design, someone steps out of time, leaves behind a footprint, a note, a photograph, or a strange machine. Not to prove anything, just to remind us that time is not a prison. It's a mystery, and we are still learning how to read it.